The 2016 election and the demise of journalistic standards. This is Ron. It is Sunday, November 26th. Welcome to Storytime. So I'm reading today from Imprimis. It is a publication of Hillsdale College, and this is volume 46, number 56, which is the May-June 2017 issue. And the what I'm reading is adapted from a speech delivered on April 20th, 2017 in Atlanta, Georgia at a Hillsdale College National Leadership Seminar, and it was delivered by Michael Goodwin. Michael Goodwin is the chief political columnist for the New York Post. He has a BA in English Literature from Columbia College and has taught at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Before joining the Post in 2009, he was the political columnist for the New York Daily News, where he served as an executive editor and editorial page editor and led its editorial board to a Pulitzer Prize. Prior to that, he worked for 16 years at the New York Times, beginning as a clerk and rising to City Hall bureau chief. He is the co-author of I, Koch, and the editor of New York Comes Back. I've been a journalist for a long time, long enough to know that it wasn't always like this. There was a time not so long ago when journalists were trusted and admired. We were generally seen as trying to report the news in a fair and straightforward manner. Today, all that has changed. For that, we can blame the 2016 election, or, more accurately, how some news organizations chose to cover it. Among the many firsts, last year's election gave us the gobsmacking revelation that most of the mainstream media puts both thumbs on the scale, and most of what you read, watch, and listen to is distorted by intentional bias and hostility. I've never seen anything like it, not even close. It's not exactly breaking news that most journalists lean left. I used to do that myself. I grew up at the New York Times, so I'm familiar with the species. For most of the media, bias grew out of the social revolution of the 60s and 70s. Fueled by the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements, the media jumped on the anti-authority bandwagon writ large. The deal was sealed with Watergate, when journalism was viewed as more trusted than government, and far more exciting and glamorous. Think Robert Redford in All the President's Men. Ever since, young people have become journalists because they wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, find a deep throat, and bring down a president. Of course, most of them only wanted to bring down a Republican president. That's because liberalism is baked into the journalism cake. During the years I spent teaching at the Columbia University School of Journalism, I often found myself telling my students that the job of the reporter was to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I'm not even sure where I first heard that line, but it still captures the way most journalists think about what they do. Translate the first part of the compassionate-sounding idea into the daily decisions about what makes news, and it's easy to fall into the habit of thinking that every person afflicted by something is entitled to help, or as liberals like to say, government is what we do together. From there, it's a short drive to the conclusion that every problem has a government solution. The rest of the journalistic ethos, afflict the comfortable, leads to the knee-jerk support of endless taxation. Somebody has to pay for that government intervention the media loves to demand. In the same vein, and for the same reason, the average reporter will support every conceivable regulation as a way to equalize conditions for the poor. He will also give sympathetic coverage to groups like Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter. A new dimension. I knew all of this about the media mindset going into the 2016 presidential campaign, but I was still shocked at what happened. This was not naive liberalism run amok. This was a whole new approach to politics. No one in modern times had seen anything like it. As with grief, there were several stages. In the beginning, Donald Trump's candidacy was treated as an outlandish publicity stunt, as though he wasn't a serious candidate and should be treated as a circus act. But television executives quickly made a surprising discovery. The more they put Trump on the air, the higher their ratings climbed. Ratings are money, So news shows started devoting hours and hours simply to pointing the cameras at Trump and letting them run. As his rallies grew, the coverage grew, which made for an odd dynamic. The candidate nobody in the media took seriously was attracting the most people to his events and getting the most news coverage. Newspapers got in on the game too. Trump, unlike most of his opponents, was always available to the press and could be counted on to say something outrageous or controversial that made headlines. He made news by being a spectacle. Despite the mockery of journalists and late-night comics, something extraordinary was happening. Trump was dominating a campaign none of the smart money thought he could win. And then, suddenly, he was winning. Only when the crowded Republican field began to thin and Trump kept racking up primary and caucus victories did the media's tone grow more serious. One study estimated that Trump had received so much free airtime that if he had to buy it, the price would have been $2 billion. The realization that they'd helped make Trump's rise seemed to make many executives, producers, and journalists furious. By the time he secured the nomination and the general election rolled around, they were gunning for him. Only 2 people now had a chance to be president, and the overwhelming media consensus was that it could not be Donald Trump. They would make sure of that. The coverage of him grew so vicious and one-sided that last August I wrote a column on the unprecedented bias under the headline, "American Journalism is Collapsing Before Our Eyes." I wrote that the so-called cream of the media crop was engaged in a naked display of partisanship designed to bury Trump and elect Hillary Clinton. The evidence was on the front page and back page, the culture pages, even the sports pages. It was at the top of the broadcast and at the bottom of the broadcast. Day in, day out, in every media market in America, Trump was savaged like no other candidate in memory. We were watching the total collapse of standards with fairness and balance tossed overboard. Every story was an opinion masquerading as news, and every opinion ran in the same direction, toward Clinton and away from Trump. For the most part, I blame the New York Times and the Washington Post for causing this breakdown. The 2 leading liberal newspapers were trying to top each other in their demonization of Trump and his supporters. They set the tone, and most of the rest of the media followed like lemmings. On one level, tougher scrutiny of Trump was clearly defensible. He had a controversial career and lifestyle, and he was seeking the presidency as his first job in government. He also provided lots of fuel with some of his outrageous words and deeds during the campaign. But from the beginning, there was also a second element to the lopsided coverage. The New York Times has not endorsed a Republican for president since Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1956, meaning it would back a dead raccoon if it had a D after its name. Think of it, George McGovern over Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter over Ronald Reagan, Walter Mondale over Reagan, any Democrat would do. And the Washington Post, which only started making editorial endorsements in the 70s, has never once endorsed a Republican for president. But again, I want to emphasize that 2016 had those predictable elements plus a whole new dimension. This time, the papers dropped the pretense of fairness and jumped headlong into the tank for one candidate over the other. The Times media reporter began a story this way. If you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalist tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how the heck are you supposed to cover him? I read that paragraph and I thought to myself, well, that's actually an easy question. If you feel that way about Trump, normal journalistic ethics would dictate that you shouldn't cover him. You cannot be fair. And you shouldn't be covering Hillary Clinton either, because you've already decided who should be president. Go cover sports or entertainment. Yet the Times media reporter rationalized the obvious bias he had just acknowledged, citing the view that Clinton was normal and Trump was not. I found the whole concept appalling. What happened to fairness? What happened to standards? I'll tell you what happened to them. The Times top editor, Dean Baquet, eliminated them. In an interview last October with the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard, Baquet admitted that the piece by his media reporter had nailed his own thinking. Trump challenged our language, he said, and Trump will have changed journalism. Of the daily struggle for fairness, Baquet had this to say: I think that Trump has ended that struggle. We now say stuff. We fact check him. We write it more powerfully that what he says is false. Baquet was being too modest. Trump was challenging, sure, but it was Baquet who had changed journalism. He's the one who decided that the standards of fairness and nonpartisanship could be abandoned without consequence. With that decision, Baquet also changed the basic news story formula. To the age-old elements of who, what, when, where, and why, he added the reporter's opinion. Now the floodgates were open, and virtually every so-called news article reflected a clear bias against Trump. Stories, photos, headlines, placement in the paper, all the tools that writers and editors have were summoned to the battle. The goal was to pick the next president. Thus began the spate of stories, which continues today, in which the Times routinely calls Trump a liar in its news pages and headlines. Again, the contrast with the past is striking. The Times never called Barack Obama a liar, despite such obvious opportunities as "you can keep your doctor" and "the Benghazi attack was caused by an internet video." Indeed, the Times and the Washington Post, along with the most of the White House press corps, spent 8 years cheerleading the Obama administration, seeing not a smidgen of corruption or dishonesty. They have been tougher on Hillary Clinton during her long career, but they still never called her a liar, despite such doozies as, "I set up my own computer server so I would only need one device. I turned over all the government emails," and "I never sent or received classified emails." All those were lies, but not to the national media. Only statements by Trump were fair game. As we now know, most of the media totally missed Trump's appeal to millions upon millions of Americans. The prejudice against him blinded those news organizations to what was happening in the country. Even more incredibly, I believe the bias and hostility directed at Trump backfired. The feeling that the decision was, in part, a referendum on the media gave some voters an extra incentive to vote for Trump. A vote for him was a vote against the media and against Washington. Not incidentally, Trump used that sentiment to his advantage, often revving up his crowds with attacks on reporters. He still does. If I haven't made it clear, let me do so now. The behavior of much of the media, but especially the New York Times, was a disgrace. I don't believe it ever will recover the public trust it squandered. The Times' previous reputation for having the highest standards was legitimate. Those standards were developed over decades to force reporters and editors to be fair and to gain public trust. The commitment to fairness made the New York Times the flagship of American journalism. But standards are like laws in the sense that they are designed to guide your behavior in good times and in bad. Consistent adherence to them was the source of the Times' credibility, and eliminating them has made the paper less than ordinary. Its only standards now are double standards. I say this with great sadness. I was blessed to grow up at the Times, getting a clerical job right out of college and working my way onto the reporting staff, where I worked for a decade. It was the formative experience of my career where I learned most of what I know about reporting and writing. Alas, it was a different newspaper then. Abe Rosenthal was the editor in those days, and long before we'd ever heard the phrase zero tolerance, that's what Abe practiced towards conflict of interest in reporters' opinions. He set the rules, and everybody knew it. Here's a true story about how Abe Rosenthal resolved a conflict of interest. A young woman was hired by the Times from one of the Philadelphia newspapers, but soon after she arrived in New York, a story broke in Philly that she had a romantic affair with a political figure she had covered, and that she had accepted a fur coat and other expensive gifts from him. When he saw the story, Abe called the woman into his office and asked her if it were true. When she said yes, he told her to clean out her desk, that she was finished at the Times and would never work there again. As word spread through the newsroom, some reporters took the woman's side and rushed in to tell Abe that firing her was too harsh. He listened for about 30 seconds, raised his hand for silence, and said, this is slightly bolderized, "I don't care if you have a romantic affair with an elephant on your personal time, but then you can't cover the circus for the paper." Case closed. The conflict of interest policy was clear, absolute, and unforgettable. As for reporters' opinions, Abe had a similar approach. He didn't want them in the news pages, and if you put them in, he took them out. They belonged in the opinion pages only, which were managed separately. Abe said he knew reporters tended to lean left and would find ways to sneak their views into stories, so he saw his job as steering the paper slightly to the right. That way, he said, the paper would end up in the middle. He was well known for his attitude, which he summed up as keeping the paper straight. He even said he wanted his epitaph to read, "He kept the paper straight." Like most people, I thought it was a joke, but after I related all this in a column last year, his widow contacted me and said it wasn't a joke. That, in fact, Abe's tombstone reads, "He kept the paper straight." She sent me a picture to prove it. I published that picture of his tombstone along with a column where I excoriated the Times for its election coverage. Sadly, the Times' high standards were buried with Abe Rosenthal. And that is going to be it for this section of this particular article. The next section is called "Looking to the Future," and I'll be covering that or reading it on Tuesday, which will be the 28th of November. And so this has been the 2016 election and the demise of journalistic standards by Michael Goodwin from the May-June issue of Imprimis magazine. And until Tuesday, thank you for joining me. Have a great day.